Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How to Reduce Financial Risk in IT, Cloud Economics and FinOps, brought to you by your Insight Managed Services team in partnership with Microsoft. I'm Claire Folger, your CSP Marketing Coordinator at Insight, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. This webcast is designed to be interactive between you and the presenters. The webcast console you are looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget at the bottom and submit your question. All questions from this webcast will be captured, and there will be a Q&A during the last few minutes of the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the question mark icon below the presentation window. The help guide covers common technical issues. I also wanted to remind you that you have the chance to win a copy of the O'Reilly book, Cloud FinOps, today based on participation. Attend all 4 sessions and get a chance to win free access to take the FinOps Certified Practitioner exam, a $300 value. This webinar series, along with the book, will give you a solid foundation to work toward passing the FinOps Practitioner certification. After today's session, our lucky winners will receive an email from me with details on receiving their free copy of the book. I would now like to turn this presentation over to our presenters, Marcus and Jeff. The floor is yours.
Great, thank
Excellent.
you, Claire. Yes, welcome to the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Marcus Benson. I'm National Principal Architect for FinOps at Insight and a former Microsoft Global Black Belt for cost management. And with me today, I have Jeff Amos. Jeff,
hello, and thanks for joining us. I have a pleasure in co-presenting with Marcus today, which I'm excited about because I think FinOps, financial operations, and cloud economics is kind of our secret passion. We certainly will demonstrate some of our excitement in the presentation today. My current title is a cloud financial architect, and that's kind of unique at Microsoft, an evolving role where we work with customers and help them get the best cost benefit out of cloud adoption, and even helping customers work through the complexities of cash flow changes as they fund their workloads and migrate workloads over to the cloud. You can think of me as like a data center architect that likes to do his own taxes. Similar to Marcus, I kind of have a technical background, but also I've blended in the financial aspects.
Great, thank you, Jeff. So our agenda today that we'll be covering is really all around FinOps and cloud economics. So the first area we're going to go into is the cost management challenge in the cloud, which is a very broad challenge we'll go into. We'll talk a little bit about cloud economics and planning for FinOps. So, what are the definitions? What is cloud economics versus FinOps? What are the benefits of cloud migration? And, what's kind of that pre-migration cost checklist that you might need to be aware of before starting to migrate these workloads? And then we'll go through the FinOps methodology. So once you actually move those workloads into the cloud, how do you continue to manage those, make sure they're optimized, and make sure that you are, bringing as much value as you can out of that spend. So the cloud cost management challenge, more than 80% of our clients say that poor financial management has a negative impact on their business. It's estimated that over 30% of all cloud spend is waste. And 69% of our customers have overspent on their budget, and 57% of them worry daily about cloud cost management. So this is top of mind for almost any customer that's consuming cloud resources today. And this is due to, obviously, the inherent complexity of moving into the cloud, where you have potentially millions of cloud resources being run in a multiple cloud environment that could span across, tens and dozens, or even, upwards of 100 different business units, project teams, or portfolios, depending on the organization that you're talking to. In each of these different areas of the business, whether you're an IT executive, a finance team, one of the business units that's actually consuming cloud, you should care about cost, and you should care about it in a few different ways. IT execs, have different priorities, obviously, than the business unit teams that are actually managing the spend and managing those resources. Things like making sure that they're staying within budget, something that executives are going to care about, versus, improving forecast accuracy, maybe a priority for finance. And then optimization of cloud resources is typically the big focus and priority for business units that are actually consuming the cloud resources. And the typical customer experience that we've seen is, this is really regardless of the size of the customer, is in most cases we see customers running an initial proof of concept in the cloud, seeing the value that cloud brings through elasticity, through control, through resiliency, all of those benefits that we talk about of moving to the cloud. But what we don't always talk about is, once they hit that large scale adoption, a lot of our clients see a loss of control. They see a surprise cloud bill. They don't understand what exactly they're paying for, who's actually running up the bill, and they can't charge back that spend to the business units that are actually consuming it. So they don't know if they're staying within budget in a lot of cases. They don't know if their spend is optimized. And if you don't have that visibility in place, you're going to have waste.
Cool. Excellent coverage. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the current state of cloud cost management. Because historically, our technology teams, the IT organizations, the CTO organizations, typically on a year-over-year basis would approach their financial group and say, this is the budgetary allocation I need for the upcoming fiscal year. However, with cloud adoption and the velocity that workloads are being modernized, the current state of tracking spend and also even introducing ideas of spending in a better way through different cost constructs on the cloud, like reserved instances or spot level instances for VMs, for example, it becomes a little bit more of a challenge. So at this point, the current state, we really need to focus on costs, because historically costs have been somewhat of an afterthought. We've always planned for budgetary allocation for like bare metal and colo agreements and those static pricing constructs. But in the cloud, it's much more flexible. Also, we're super focused now on cost transparency. As Marcus mentioned, a lot of the business consumers, the business units, or even technology teams, at this point in time, don't have full transparency into what their spend is. Even on premise, there may be some hidden cost of infrastructure or power consumption, those HVAC costs that are costly for on-premise data centers. Even today, a lot of the business units or technology teams don't have that transparency into what that looks like. Also, on the cloud, you have flexibility in modernizing the workloads beyond just compute, those VM instances, like moving your transactional stores to the PaaS level meters, where you're accelerating the velocity of the value of every dollar of IT investment. You're getting more transactions out of every dollar of investment over time. And those are advantages that you could look at as potential options for maturing your workloads. Also, there's historically been challenges in and around aligning the governance of overall policies that are applied to workloads. Even from the finance perspective, when we're doing financial analytics on overall spend and budgetary allocation to business units, we're looking for specific tags of resources. A very important concept in the overall FinOps type of practice is classifying the workloads and spend in an appropriate way. So we're going to have a quick Q&A or a quick questionnaire to get an idea in and around your biggest challenge when it comes to managing your cloud investment, to get a little bit of insight and help Marcus and I redirect some of the content in the latter part of this session.
Yeah, and the list that you see here is really a list of some of the most common challenges that FinOps teams face today. Getting engineers to take action on cost, forecasting, enabling automation, reducing waste, shared service costs, full allocation of spend. These are all major challenges that a lot of organizations are faced with today. So you're not unique in these challenges. So please let us know what challenges you're facing as a FinOps team. Okay.
Oh, two huge ones, 50-50 at the top. Getting engineers to take action on cost optimization. It's an excellent one. The concept of designing for cost or architecting for cost. A lot of times, especially with legacy-based applications, we're used to running it in a compute instance, whether it's physical gear or physical or a virtual machine on top of a hypervisor, and just relocating or repositioning or migrating that workload over to the cloud. And we're not necessarily introducing some profound changes, although we're still catering to the technical requirements of the workload. So in a lot of those cases, and I'll just make a quick comment on this one, where we're trying to get engineers, application architects to do the right thing, as we have more transparency in around spend, and also from a FinOps type of practice, suggest changes that have great financial impact. We see a more accelerated adoption of architectural changes of applications.
And we've got a couple more responses now. So it looks like forecasting is, really the biggest challenge here with the group that we have on this call today. And that's not a huge surprise. That is definitely a very challenging, activity with regards to cloud spend and moving into that, OpEx model. So let's set a little bit of context here and just talk a little bit about, the differences between what cloud economics is and what FinOps is. So Jeff, I'll let you cover this one.
Yeah, excellent. So two key concepts, cloud economics and FinOps, financial operations. Starting with cloud economics. I view cloud economics as like the study of benefits and costs and some of the principles in and around it of moving workloads over to the cloud. Meaning inside of the cloud, there's different offer constructs. I mentioned reserved instances or those long-term commits that are lower price point than paying by the hour, for example. Within cloud economics, it's the definition of what those savings levers look like, and also helping you define what that total cost of ownership may look like. So it's really analyzing the benefits of a cloud. Separate from FinOps. Now, FinOps is more, how do we operationalize it? How do we take those savings levers, those concepts of cloud benefits, and actually measure it? And it could go down to hour by hour, week by week, or month by month, revisiting what we have deployed to the cloud, taking the concepts of cloud economics and operationalizing it in a way that we proactively can suggest architectural changes or the adoption of different offering constructs or consumption constructs in the cloud to get the benefit. So FinOps is evolving very rapidly with respect to financial management, the disciplines in and around them. And there's an excellent resource, and it's even mentioned in the source in the bottom right of the slide. There's FinOps.org, the FinOps Foundation, that helps define a lot of like their guidelines and their principles that again kind of take the concepts of cloud economics and roll it into how we operationalize it. Everything from tactical activities of tagging workloads, so you can classify those spends, of that spend, and even groups of meters into a specific workload attached to like a cost center, for example, all the way up to how do we create new KPIs of financial success over time.
And I would even go so far as to say that cloud economics is a part of FinOps and part of the informed phase of FinOps, specifically around workload placement and understanding that upfront analysis of spend and TCO.
Excellent. And as we think about those two categories and concepts and the frameworks attached to them, we immediately think about, well, what are some of the initial benefits? Now, from the technical side, certainly as you look to the cloud, you have greater abilities to scale, scaling out your workloads, and equally importantly, scaling down your workloads when they're not necessarily in use. Adjacent to that is the higher level of availability on the technical side for the cloud target. All of the cloud providers, including Azure on the Microsoft side, design their data centers to be highly available. So we're inherently taking on that cost of deploying an infrastructure that you don't necessarily have to do any longer on premise, as well as some of the inherent security, compliance, and policy type of mechanisms that are built into the cloud target, as well as the ability to do that capacity optimization, which kind of maps back to scalability, where you could scale up and down depending on your overall usage. Now, these technical benefits go hand in hand. They're very tightly knit with the financial benefits, where you're changing your overall budgetary allocation from a CapEx category to like an OpEx. or reducing your overall data center footprint requirements. And those could be your physical data centers that you own or amortize, or your colo or hosting agreements and reducing those. Redirecting your IT funding where you're getting more cost benefit, more transactions per dollar. As well as we've seen staffing productivity increase. We're reclassifying some of the activities and roles that we historically have seen inside of those IT service management type of roles to have higher levels of outcome or productivity from their work, as well as an overall benefit of adopting the cloud. And this is a measure that a lot of companies are really looking at, is sustainability. As we're investing in these data centers, they consume a lot of power and electricity. Certainly, as we look at the large-scale data centers of the cloud targets, you're getting that benefit of sustainability at scale. Oops, sorry, one click too many. So how do you unlock the financial value of the cloud? I mentioned that it's this tight communication between your application teams, your business units, your IT service management organization, as well as finance. At no other point in IT history have we seen a tighter connection between the CTO organization and the CFO organization, where they're providing interactive feedback between the two teams to do, one, the best thing in architecting for cost, as well as creating new KPIs. And this changes the overall financial positioning of how you fund resources, your workloads in the cloud, as well as on-premise, and seeing what new KPIs are created, measures of success over time. A lot of them are still technical. Are we still delivering the necessary technical specifications and requirements to the business units, to the consumers of these services that IT is providing, as well as new KPIs and financial success of, as we modernize our workloads over time, how are we doing better over time, which we'll touch on in just a minute. And in a lot of these cases, we create new processes, new workflows, and new relationships between the technical and financial organizations, a lot of which are covered in that FinOps.org and inherent within a lot of the frameworks and guidelines and around financial operations of the cloud. So a good example about how cash flow changes is represented in this graph. So for example, we have 5,000 VMs running in our on-premise data center, and we want to move them over to a cloud target. We want to get that financial benefit and lower our overall spend. In a lot of cases, we see this first phase of migration as what I classify as a double mortgage period. We still have cash flow supporting the on-premise data centers. We're executing a move of the workload, which inherently has some cost attached to it, and then we're taking on cloud meter cost. And this is a challenging financial period, where represented here is migration bubble, that double mortgage period. And in a lot of business cases that I see from customers where they project out what their cash flow looks like after they move their workloads, that's kind of that TCO phase. What's that total cost of ownership after we've moved our workloads? And inherently in a lot of these business cases, I see that missing timeline of the migration bubble and what that cost looks like. And then also, after you've moved your workloads over, there's always an opportunity to improve your overall spend. It could be through architectural changes of the applications, taking on PaaS meters, or taking on different license or consumption constructs of the cloud, those reserved instances, those other cost benefits that we might be able to redirect to. So that cost optimization phase is always ongoing. How do we architect better? How do we consume these different offer constructs in a better way? So this is not a fire and forget exercise. A lot of times I've worked with customers to create that financial timeline with iterations of timelines within even those cost optimization phases. So as we talk about financial operations and cloud economics, I view it as an ongoing exercise, iterations of improvement over time. I've even had cases where customers start with just a simple lift and shift, reduce their overall required cash flow by 18 to 20%, and they don't go back to their CFO and say, we're going to reduce our budgets, but they go back to the CFO and say, we're going to take that reduction in cash flow, reinvest it into our workloads, modernize them to those PaaS level meters, the richer meters, where we're doing more with the same price point. And so it becomes a self-funding activity, which ends up being highly effective. So as you start thinking about your migration, we want to share a little bit of thoughts in a pre-migration checklist. Certainly capture clear requirements. As you're going to your business unit, start looking at the workflow. Some of the challenges in and around perhaps data sovereignty, where you need to locate your particular data sets. Is there some regulatory guidelines in and around that? Think about your security infrastructure, even like your directories and how you do authentication, as well as some of your availability requirements and percentage uptimes for workloads. As you look at even an workload instance, you can use the Azure pricing calculator to kind of estimate out different scenarios. What if I just did a lift and shift to a VM target on Azure? What's that price point? Or if some of those VMs were running transactional stores, like SQL, for example, what are the price points of hosting that at the PaaS layers where I'm only focused on the transactional store and not the underlying compute and having to manage that, for example. Also within some of those initial costs, we have a calculator for projecting out what that total cost of ownership looks like on Azure.com. It's a good reference, but a lot of times I work with customers to customize it and map it back to actual budgetary allocation, which also our partners at Insight are amazingly good at. Also, define policies and constraints. Now, these a lot of times aren't just technical policies, but they could be policies in and around the consumption constructs on the cloud target. Like adoption of reserved instances for those long-running compute instances, or even spot-level pricing for compute for dev test workloads that are only up like a certain percentage of time throughout a month. Also, within these policies and somewhat mapped to the FinOps type of guidelines, how do we tag these resources in a way that are grouping workloads together, as well as map back to business units, so we can revisit what that cost calculation looks like and even proactively suggest changes. Also, identifying shared assets, and that's kind of a challenge even in on-premise data centers. Redirecting budgetary allocation or spend to multiple units, and tagging of resources in the FinOps frameworks certainly is helpful in that category. Also think about that financial governance, and also not just the governance around it, but also the cadence. I found in working with many customers that we used to do this year-over-year review of the next fiscal year spend for an IT organization and meet with finance on a 12-month cycle. But with cloud adoption, especially going through those migration phases where we want to minimize that double mortgage period, the time frame attached to it, and the cost, we find meetings happening even more frequently, week by week, and that cadence tends to turn to month by month, where we have the technical orgs, the application design teams, as well as finance in the room, interactively suggesting changes for financial benefits. I'll pause there.
Yeah, and those budgets in the cloud are really iterative, need to be iterative, and need to be flexible. You know, in the cloud, those static annual budgets really just don't work.
Cool.
So, you know, beyond just the checklist of, you know, preparing for cost, you know, how do you actually architect your workloads for cost? Well, there's a few considerations. The first is geographic. You know, so cross-geo workloads, cross-region workloads can get very expensive with ingress and egress charges. So looking at, you know, is this a multi-geo workload? Is this a single geo workload? And understanding the cheapest region to run those workloads in are a few of those areas that you should be considering when it comes to geography. Subscription type is another dev test workloads. Azure does offer a dev test subscription type, which offers automatic discounting on certain service areas, gives you Linux VM pricing on Windows machines, which cuts out the OS cost, as well as some other services like HD Insights, et cetera. So it does require Visual Studio subscriptions, so just be aware of that to use that dev test offer type, but it will give you discounted pricing automatically. And it does not have a financially backed SLA, so just be aware of that. Proper resource sizing. So before you move a workload into the cloud, do your due diligence of actual resource consumption. You know, just doing a apples to apples lift and shift of a VM into the cloud typically is not the smartest thing to do in the cloud, because on premise, you're usually over provisioning those workloads to plan for future capacity. In the cloud, you don't need to do that. You really only need to be using what you actually need today. And if those workload requirements change in the future, you can adjust and scale with those requirements. On demand versus reserved. So when you're architecting these resources, look to leverage reserved instance and reserved capacity programs when they're available. Typically, those programs can offer anywhere from 20% all the way up to potentially 70, 80% discounting, depending on the service, depending on the scope of what you set that to as well. And typically the payback period for production workloads that are running 24/7 is right around 7 months. So if you know that you have workloads that are actually going to be around for more than 7 months that are on all the time, they're typically a pretty good candidate for reservation. Use POC deployments. So don't start from scratch. There's a ton of resources out there to help you, accelerate, your architecture into the cloud. There's the Azure Architecture Center, which has reference architectures that can serve as a starting point for different workload types and different solutions that you may be looking at moving. And try to go PaaS first or SaaS first whenever possible. The ROI of running PaaS versus IaaS is huge. It's typically somewhere around 500% ROI with around an 80% reduction in IT time needed to support those resources, which, if you look up IaaS versus PaaS versus SaaS responsibilities, there's some really good diagrams and charts out there that show you how this really reduces the overhead on your team.
Yeah, excellent coverage, and thank you there. And certainly, as you think about these first steps, an additional reminder, I know we stated it a couple times, it's not a fire and forget exercise. So initially, start looking at the KPIs you want to achieve, not just from the technical side, because even if you start with a lift and shift, just moving a VM to the IaaS target, you will see a reduced required budgetary allocation of cash flow to support that workload. But what are some of those ongoing KPIs? Do you want to reduce in a 12-month time frame your overall required cash flow by 20% or something along those lines, as well as defining some of the timelines of those goals, and especially the migration execution phase where you want to minimize that double mortgage period. And then as you look at your first couple of workloads, revisit what those success factors look like. You may be changing some of your measures of success, some of those fundamental KPIs through discovery, through some of those experiences. And then start validating some of your early assumptions. And then an additional reminder, we can't say this enough, repeat the process on a more frequent time basis. Take some of the FinOps operational suggestions and guidelines and adopt them internally. And as you modernize workloads over time, certainly look at, as you're freeing up that budgetary allocation, where can you better reinvest those in modernizing other workloads at a more accelerated rate. Oops, so we have another poll question.
Yes, so the poll question is, do you have a process in place today for planning, modeling, and capturing those requirements of new workloads in the cloud? Very, very important when you're doing this planning and that forecasting effort annually to understand what new workloads are coming, when, and potentially how much they cost. Okay. So far, yes, 100%. That is very, very good to hear.
It's fantastic to hear at this point, because even if you look like 6 months back, they'd be a little bit more distributed. So we've got a little bit on at this time kind of filtering in. I had this same type of session almost 12 months ago, and almost 90% of the response was it's either on the roadmap or not at this time. So seeing some yes pop in there, that's fantastic to see.
Yep, and there's some on the roadmap responses right there as well. Awesome. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about cloud economics and that planning for cloud and planning for migration, once you land those workloads in the cloud, how do you manage your spend? How do you optimize those workloads? How do you continue to improve on these processes? And that's really where the FinOps methodology comes in. FinOps is an open source framework. It's part of the Linux Foundation today, has a full set of certifications. and framework materials available out at finops.org. One of the main concepts to understand around FinOps would be, really these 6 main principles of FinOps, which are really those kind of North Stars, guiding principles for a FinOps team to follow. The first one, in my opinion, is really the most important, and that is teams need to collaborate. You need to be able to break down those silos, those fiefdoms across the organization. You need to have those business unit teams that are actually consuming spend in the cloud, talking to finance, talking to the FinOps team, talking to the center of excellence to understand governance requirements and financial governance requirements for ongoing spend management. Talking to that FinOps team to understand what reporting is available for them. So in the cloud, decisions really do need to be driven by the value that decision is driving for the cloud. For example, if you're moving a new workload into the cloud, what's the financial benefit of doing that? If there's not, then why move it? So understand that when you are creating spend in the cloud, you should be thinking about what's the value that this spend is bringing to my organization before moving those workloads, obviously. Everyone needs to take ownership. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And with respect to teams collaborating and also the decisions being driven by actual data, usage information coming from like the billing and usage APIs. A lot of times I see those FinOps roles, whether they're formalized into a formal organization within the company, or they're just kind of dotted line roles that may land in the technical or financial group. I see those roles kind of playing almost a marriage counselor relationship between the CTO and the CFO, bringing the information that both of them need to make the best decisions, both on architectural change and financial investment or budgetary allocation. And those roles formalizing over time. And I think Marcus has a great slide coming up in a couple that kind of defines some of those roles that we could talk through.
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to Office Space and Milton, we're the ones that are talking to the engineers. So in the cloud, it's really a shared accountability model. Everyone needs to take ownership of their usage. If you have the ability to create a resource in the cloud, you are ultimately accountable and responsible for the spend of that resource and making sure that you're properly managing and configuring those resources with cost in mind. FinOps reports need to be accessible and timely. Accessible, timely reporting enables fast feedback loops, enables quicker response to things like anomaly detection and potentially major issues in your environment. To give an example, FinOps and financial metrics in the cloud, really should be considered an operational metric because you can run the same workload in 2 different machine types, and those are both going to, run great. But if one is, three sizes larger than the other, you're going to notice that on your cloud bill. So that's really, why you should be looking at cost as that operational metric, because if you're not paying attention performance-wise, you may not notice the difference, but when you get that bill at the end of the month, you'll definitely notice the difference. And a centralized team really needs to drive FinOps. So, figure out where in the organization this team should live. I've seen it within Cloud Center of Excellence, within a cloud governance function, within cloud finance teams. But really the important thing is there's a central FinOps team that is helping to drive the policies, procedures, the processes, the reporting, as well as rate negotiations and some of those pricing improvement pieces.
We can never forget variable. We can never forget procurement. That's a great team that works a lot with the finance type of roles within the customer base that loops into like the next point of taking advantage of those variable cost models and different offer constructs from the cloud. And equally important, and that's coming from a Microsoft person, negotiating with those cloud providers for the best price points for the things you're actually using. A lot of that type of insight as you move your workloads starts transpiring as you do those transparent reporting type of mechanisms. You're identifying specific compute types that you use or specific PAS meters that cater to your workloads and looking at the trends of that. And those could be rolled into even the enterprise agreements with like Microsoft or Amazon or GCP, where you have more impactful discounts where they're applied to things that you're actually using or planning or projecting to use as well.
Yeah, and that variable cost model can be a scary thing, but learn to take advantage of it because, as many customers that do get those surprise cloud bills, there's, on the other side of the coin, a lot of customers that are really leveraging things like auto scale, auto shutdown capabilities to really only be paying for what they actually need, which allows them to reduce their overall TCO. And so I mentioned this centralized FinOps team. So the way that this central FinOps team should be working within the organization is you can see these different teams on the left-hand side here. The FinOps team needs to be collaborating with engineering, with operations, with the infrastructure teams that are actually creating those resources in the cloud to make sure that those teams understand their responsibilities from a cost management perspective, from a governance perspective, and working with those different business teams as well to take into consideration, potentially performance impacts to cost changes, things like that, as well as understanding, the applications and the workloads that are actually being run out there, in which case that FinOps team may be able to help optimize by moving certain services to paths or helping identify modernization opportunities. The FinOps team also needs to be talking to the executive team. Executive sponsorship is a very important piece of ongoing FinOps success. A lot of engineers have a ton of priorities, a lot on their plate, and in most cases, cost is really kind of pretty low on that priority list. And executive sponsorship, organizational change management can really help drive that adoption and ROI. And then chatting with finance procurement to understand what those budgetary numbers are, as well as help with ongoing forecasting and prediction of future cost. And from an optimization standpoint, as a best practice, usage optimization, things like right sizing, deleting unattached disks, deleting unused resources really should be handled by the individuals that actually own those resources. And that central FinOps team's responsibility in that is providing the data, the visibility, and the education to those users so they know how to best take care of and manage their resources in the cloud.
Oh, so we had a great question pop up in the chat that maybe we could share on this slide since I think it's pretty applicable. The question is, how does FinOps incorporate other financial components other than cost change from one provider to another? And there was mention of cost avoidance, avoiding extended SLAs, or those soft costs such as labor reduction from switching from an IaaS model to a PaaS model. And is there something that the FinOps team would encapsulate and update? So the short answer, and I'll let Marcus jump in after I do a quick answer, is yes. It's that FinOps type of role to offer and do those analysis of different potential paths a workload could take, a business unit can take. A lot of times I'll see the FinOps groups actually pull in retail pricing from each cloud provider, AWS, GCP, and Azure, and look at the different potential cost constructs and overall cash flow requirements as those are potential targets. Even beyond the targets, what offering constructs are the most advantageous, and almost acting as not just a broker, but more of a consultant back into the business units, the application development teams, and even back into finance and procurement. Here are some of our concrete recommendations. So it's like working through those what-if scenarios. Now, to be fair and transparent, the IT service management costs, the labor reduction costs between different customers can be highly different, highly dynamic. Like, for example, some industry verticals are more effective or efficient in how they do IT service management, help desk activities, IT type of activities. The oil and gas industry vertical is highly efficient in how they allocate headcount versus maybe the retail industry vertical that is not as efficient. And I share that because it's a lot of times when you look at labor reduction costs, they're hard to quantify without actually measuring them over time. You can ballpark the potential percentage reduction, but it won't be as concrete as modeling out a lift and shift or a move to PaaS, where it's a much more concrete cash flow analysis. The labor reduction is a little bit fuzzier, but I'll let Marcus jump in.
Yeah, and I think that all kind of comes back into that FinOps Inform phase, and a major part of that FinOps Inform phase is understanding fully loaded costs, which fully loaded costs could include some of those additional soft costs, like labor, like IT work, support, that kind of thing, that don't necessarily come through in that billing file from your cloud provider. And so the typical FinOps team structure that we see, I love this diagram from FinOps World. You can see in the gray area here, this is really kind of your core team. Most mature FinOps organizations that we see today have multiple roles and typically at least one full-time FinOps lead who spends their entire day living and breathing FinOps and optimization and providing that value to the business. Typically, you'll see other roles like an architect, an R&D, a DevOps role. Sometimes these can be part-time roles or borrowed roles from other areas of the Cloud Center of Excellence, maybe the cloud automation team, cloud governance team to help with some of those financial policies, automation for shutdown schedules, things that are also FinOps related, but highly technical pieces that you really do need to have that architect or R&D lead there to support you. And there's also, these other roles that are part of the business that all need to participate in FinOps in different areas depending on the discussion, whether it's forecasting, budgeting, optimization, that kind of stuff. And this is really how that team should be working along these other teams within the environment. This is a little bit of an eye chart. We will be sharing this deck out, but some of these activities could be things like tagging standards and compliance, helping app teams identify workload level cost efficiency, business unit economics, bottom-up planning and forecasting. And depending on the activity, the FinOps team is going to need to engage different areas of the business to consult, inform, or hold them accountable for these different areas. And so the FinOps methodology is really a three-phased approach of inform, optimize, and operate. The inform phase is all around creating visibility, anomaly detection, show back, charge back reporting, budgets, forecasts, and maybe setting up some of those initial KPIs and metrics that you can measure your success with. When you move into the optimize phase, it's all around reducing pricing and reducing what you're actually using in the cloud to optimize your cost. If you think about optimization in the most basic form, cost equals usage times rate. So there's two different ways to reduce your cost, either rate reduction or usage reduction in the cloud. And without the visibility of the inform phase, you're not going to know where you have waste. So it is important to start with the inform phase, move into optimization, and then continuously try to improve on your capabilities, these activities, that collaboration between the business, maybe introducing additional automation to take some of these responsibilities off of architects' plates. But it's really important to move quickly through these three phases and continue to iterate and get better as you go. And it's also important to note that most organizations don't try to do everything all at once and don't have the ability to do everything all at once. So typical FinOps maturity lifecycle follows a crawl, walk, run methodology of, maybe initially you need to identify the initial stakeholders that care about FinOps. You need to gain that initial visibility, create those initial reports, understand where that waste might be in your environment, who's responsible for that waste, and identify some of those governance gaps that could be preventing you from managing your spend properly. As you mature, maybe you start thinking about things like cost allocation, show back, charge back reporting to create that accountability, defining some of those initial budgets with alerts set up, providing education to different users and personas within your organization around FinOps and what their accountability is with regards to FinOps. Maybe then you're starting to remove some of those unused resources, purchase reservations. And then as you mature and get, better at this, you might have some additional challenges that start to come up, like container cost allocation, shared service cost allocation. Maybe you're starting to set up some of those monthly ongoing cadences with different business owners and stakeholders, continuing to automate and drive, new technology and new capabilities within the FinOps team. So today, do you have a formalized FinOps team practice in your organization? This is another poll question here. We'll give it a minute for folks to respond.
Yeah, while they're responding, even on the last slide where we're talking about crawl, walk, run, excuse me, I like to use the analogy of like peeling the onion. The first couple of layers are pretty easy. You can get through it. You're generating some reports back to the business units. The next layers, you're starting to tag workloads more, classify spend at a more granular level, even down to like management groups, for example. But it gets a little bit more challenging, but you're adding more value over time. So when you think about this activity, adopting these frameworks and these processes, and you're developing new KPIs and reports, think about it as iterations of modernization, even in through those practices over time. Because initially, it's kind of like being told to eat the whole elephant. It feels like a lot, and you're getting a huge amount of usage data back from the cloud. But take it in those phases of value over time.
Great. We got some responses here. It looks like the majority does not have a formalized FinOps team in place today, which is very, very common. We see this in a lot of enterprise customers. A lot of customers that we're seeing now that have adopted FinOps are starting to grow those teams and add headcount to those teams. So definitely something to start thinking about. So where do you go to get more mature in FinOps? How do you, get better at this? Well, from a baselining and modeling perspective, here are some of the tools that can help you. There's benchmarking tools out there that can give you a good idea of where you're at today, what's your maturity, and where are some of those gaps. There's well-architected reviews to do cost optimization assessments of different workloads. So looking at, from a well-architected framework perspective, have I actually architected this workload properly with cost in mind? And then there's also an open source FinOps maturity assessment that you can take. It's a little raw today. It's out there on GitHub, but driving through some of these questions will give you a good idea of what your maturity is. You can also get FinOps certified. I would highly encourage you to go out and take a certification exam at learn.finops.org. There's different exams and certifications depending on your role within the organization and what your function is within the FinOps team. So there's a practitioner, there's a professional level exam that's really that next level of the practitioner. And then there's also courses for FinOps for engineers and cost allocation. So, maybe you're struggling with shared cost allocation. Maybe you're struggling to get engineers to take action on their spend. Well, these are great ways to help mature that within your organization. And then, obviously, you can reach out to a partner like us, Insight. We have our own set of standard FinOps offerings and capabilities, consulting, managed services, and tools that we can help you leverage to gain that better visibility, better processes, and continue to help you mature those organizations. And so we have a few more parts to this webinar series. So the part 2 is going to be focused around FinOps inform phase. Part 2 or 3 is going to be around optimize, and part 4 is really going to be diving deep into the operate phase. So please do join us for the next few sessions, and there will be, I believe, some raffles at the end of this, including the FinOps Foundation and FinOps Framework book, as well as, I believe, a couple of certification exams. And so you can scan this QR code to learn more about FinOps and request a follow-up from your Insight rep around our capabilities.
Oh, and I want to jump in and say thanks to Insight for pulling this together. It's been a pleasure to participate. And a huge thank you to Marcus. When we were first pulling this content together, we had a ton because we love this subject, and it's been a great time engaging with customers and helping them through this process. And so huge thank you to Marcus for also working closely to pull all of this together.
Yep. I saw another question come in. How does Insight stay up to date on public cloud's daily changes? Well, at Insight, we have over 1,500 cloud architects across the world in different organizations. They're all driving towards, digital transformation for our clients. So we've got SMEs in every single area of cloud that their full-time job is really just to stay completely up to date in their area, and bring that level of expertise to our clients on a daily basis. All right. Well, thank you from Insight and Microsoft, and we hope to see you on the next couple of sessions.
Thank you, presenters, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Hope you have a great rest of your day.